I want to talk this morning about a timeless book. There are a lot of people who look at this book and think, well, it's sort of outdated, it's old-fashioned, and I want us to have an appreciation when we leave today about this timeless book. Grab that pew Bible, or if you have your own Bible, look in 2 Chronicles chapter 34. 2 Chronicles chapter 34, because we're going to be talking about the time when a Bible got lost. Can you imagine losing the Bible? You see, the time that Bible was lost in 2 Chronicles chapter 34, the Bible had been lost for 75 years. What if that happened in America? You stop and think about the fact that as godless as our nation is now, and as much as it struggles with spirituality, what if for the last 75 years there'd been no Bible? And yet that's what's happened in 2 Chronicles chapter 34. But there's a young king there in this chapter by the name of Josiah. He becomes king when he's about 8 years of age, and he does not immediately start leading Israel in the paths of righteousness. But he's not on the throne until very long, until he says, there's that temple that Solomon has built. We need to restore that temple. So in the process of restoring the temple, they find a copy of the Bible. I want you to imagine that. I don't know who discovered it. In my imagination, I try to stand there, and there's all of that rubble, and there's all of that whatever that temple looked like at that time and at that place. All of a sudden, somebody comes up and says, look what we have here. We have the writings of Moses, have the writings of the prophets. And as they begin to look at this, that book is brought to young King Josiah. And when Josiah recognizes what he has, he calls all of the people together. Look in verse 31. The king stood in his place. Well, look in verse 30 first. He calls all of the men of Judah, all of the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the priests and the Levites, and all of the people, great and small. He's got the Bible. And so he assembles all of the people, great and small. I assume that means important and unimportant. But in view that when Ezra read the book, they even had the children there. The smallness may refer not to their grandeur and their place in society, but perhaps even their stature. Just imagine being there as Josiah stands up and says, look what I have in my hands. We have found in the renovation of this temple, we have found the Bible. And he read in their hearing all of the words of the book of the covenant which had been found. He stood in his place before the Lord and made a covenant to follow the Lord, and listen to this words, to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all of his heart and all of his soul, to perform the words of the covenant that were written in the book. And then in the last part of verse 33, all of his days they did not depart from following the Lord their God, the God of their fathers. Imagine how this story in 2 Chronicles chapter 34 shows to us that a book that was almost 1,000 years old when it was discovered, when they started reading the book, they said, that has application to our lives. It's not just an old book, an old manuscript about something that existed, rather fascinating book, interesting to read. But they recognized that they held in their hands the very Word of God, and this very point, and that is the Bible never goes out of date. We live in an age in which there's a lessening appreciation for the Bible, but you and I need to understand that the Bible is not set within a time frame. But the entirety of the Bible, even those things that were written aforetime, before the New Testament, that they have place and importance in our hearts and in our lives because the Bible is timeless. Look first at the timelessness of the Old Testament. We'll talk about the New Testament in a moment. But I want you to just stop and reflect for a moment that the stories in the Bible never get old. They never get old. Think about the story of the creation. Think about how much that's discussed in America. Sometimes it's treated with disrespect, but who is there in this land who does not believe or who does not understand that there is this ancient book that begins, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth? Who has not been fascinated by the story of the creation? And who in this land does not at least know in part the story about Adam and Eve? I want you to think about that. Think of all the books that you read in high school. Think of all the books that you perhaps read even when you're younger than that. And those books, they're ancient books. You haven't thought about them in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. But here's a book that is anciently old. Here's this anciently old book, 3,500 years old. And it's still timely. Think about the story of Noah and the flood. The popularity of that recent movie that came out shows that there's a fascination in this land about that very story. As David was teaching this class this morning about God writing and that God didn't send text messages, my thoughts immediately got over to this very story and thinking about God and Noah and wondered what text message God would send to the people. And I just wondered if God ever put O-M-M in His text message. You can work on that one. Oh, my mankind. You stop and think about it. How timely that is. You stop and think about the story of the Red Sea. Who has not been knowledgeable in this land about the crossing of the Red Sea and about what happened at Mount Sinai and the golden calf? Those are not just ancient stories. Those are stories that when we call them to mind, we immediately make application of them in our lives. And it allows us to use those very stories in conversations with individuals. They're well acquainted with it. It's not an ancient book full of old stories that have no meaning. The Bible has relevancy today. And who has not heard and thought of the story about Samson and Delilah? Who has not thought about David and Bathsheba? And even more in focus of the timelessness of the Bible, I want to call attention to our Vacation Bible School this week. I want you to think about it. Here our young people will be looking at a book that talks about the very creation of God. And they'll be amazingly fascinated by the things that are there. And you could not help, could you, as you walked in this morning? You saw how that foyer was decorated. You could not help but just to have a good, warm, fuzzy feeling inside your heart about, this is really going to be good. It's really going to be something. I personally like that big dinosaur that's over there. And I want to commend those who made this decoration in here. I'm so thankful that you didn't put a gator in here, and I'm thankful that there's no hurricane that's depicted up here. I've looked for an eagle, and I cannot find an eagle. And I know there's no Seminole Indians up here, but I'm just glad that this decoration is here, especially that over on that side of the building, and you can work on that one too if you like. Timeliness. Do you know how important this Vacation Bible School is to us? We're talking a lot this year, and we'll be talking even more when Josh arrives, about this church as a family and the intergenerational reaction there is what needs to be within this congregation. If you really love our young people, if you want to let them know of your interest in them and your appreciation for all that they're doing, I would encourage you to be here tonight. I'd encourage you to be here tomorrow night and on through Wednesday night and be here and become a part of this Vacation Bible School. Now, there will be those adult classes and classes for those children who are older that will not have within this some of the frivolity of the little children. But I'll guarantee you that these little children will be thrilled whenever they see you, those of us who are older, involved in the kinds of singing that they're doing in the first part of that. Why? Is that just for fun and frivolity? Oh, no. And so our children will see that the family of God in this place is interested in children. In connection with that, I would encourage every one of you, perhaps this morning, maybe get here early tonight, sometime this week, walk down that hallway and look in every classroom as you go down that hallway. You'll begin seeing that we have so many individuals, particularly among our young adults, who are giving of themselves and spending hours and hours and hours because they believe that it is important for people to know this timeless book. It is a book that is timeless. Not only are all of the stories in there that never grow old, recognize the fact that when God gave Judaism, when it all started, when that Old Testament law became a formal public kind of worshiping of God, God intended for it to be permanent. And I put the word perpetual in quotation marks because the Hebrew word that sometimes in relationship to the Old Testament sacrifices, or in relationship to the Sabbath, or in relationship to the burning of incense, or in the relationship to laws about slavery and things of that nature, uses that particular Hebrew word that emphasizes the timelessness of those things. So when God gave those things, He gave them perpetually, not in the same sense as our English word emphasizes, but it means as far as we can see. And so God gave the laws, and He gave the sacrifices, and He gave incense, and He said to the Jewish nation, look, this is not just a law that Moses has given, this is here as far as we can see. Perpetual in that nation. And you and I need to understand that because of that importance of that Old Testament law, God protected that Old Testament law and protected every letter and every mark that the first scribe who wrote down those words in Genesis all the way through the book of Malachi, that God protected every letter that they wrote. Hear the words of Jesus. Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 and 18 says, do not think that I've come to destroy the law and the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Assuredly I say unto you, till heaven and earth, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till it's all fulfilled. I've come to fulfill it, and until that law is fulfilled, every jot. You know what a jot is? It's the tiniest letter in the Hebrew alphabet. I once asked an individual who could read the Old Testament in the original language very well. I said, would you take a section of the Bible and tell me how many jots there are? And he took the first 3 chapters of Genesis and came back and says, in those first 3 chapters of Genesis, there are more than 200 jots in just 3 chapters. Now imagine Moses sitting down and writing, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. And how many times in the writing of and God said, and God created, and God made. How many times in that Genesis story of every tree in this garden thou mayest freely eat. How many times in those first 3 chapters of Genesis, how many times he uses that jot? Over 200 times. And Jesus said, that was written 1,500 years ago. And 1,500 years later, every jot is there. If you believe in Jesus, you'd stand back and in awe and think of the fact that when God gave that Old Testament, He protected every aspect of it. Every jot. And tittle is a word that can be applied to the Hebrew language in a very interesting way. But tittle is also used in English. You may not be aware of this, but if you'll think of a capital F and a capital E, do you know the name of that little line that you draw across the bottom to turn a capital F into a capital E? Do you know the name of that bar? Probably not, but it is a tittle. That's the way you change a big letter F into the big letter E. You put another little bar. And tittle were found throughout the Old Testament. There were many of the Hebrew letters that were so much like the other Hebrew letter. And it'd be the twisting of a letter, one way or the other. The twisting of a mark as individual would be writing and copying. And Jesus said, 1,500 years ago, Moses started writing this, and the scribes had copied it again and again and again. And God has protected the Bible down to this degree, 1,500 years later, that every jot and every tittle, every letter and every mark of the Old Testament was still there. What does that tell you about the timeliness of this Old Testament book? It's timeless because when God gave that Old Testament, God made no provisions at all for anybody to change what He had given. Moses, write down the book of Exodus, write the book of Leviticus, write down these words. And as Moses writes down these words, a part of the message that God gave to him, Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 2 says, "You shall not add to the word which I command you, nor shall you take from it, that you may keep the commandments." Chapter 12 and verse 32, Moses, who wrote down those first jots and tittles, said to the individuals that whatever I command you, be careful to observe it. You shall not add to it or take away from it. You got that same concept in Proverbs chapter 30. Do you understand? God gave that law. It was a timeless law. And God protected every jot and every tittle so much that He said, don't you go trying to change any of that. You and I need to understand that men had the right to ignore it. And as they did in the days of Josiah, it had been ignored for 75 years, and they found the Bible. They found a book that had been written, parts of it 1,000 years before that time. And they opened up that book. You see, that book that had been followed in the days of Moses, doing everything according to the way that God had commanded it, produced Judaism at Mount Sinai. People lost it. In the days of Josiah, the temple was in disarray. You know what they did? They took that same book, and with the same heart that individuals had at Mount Sinai, they restored Judaism, not a new religion. The message of that book was given by God, and it was timeless, it was unchangeable, it was protected by God. And they were able to restore Judaism to exactly the same way it was at the beginning. That's how timeless the Bible is. Look at the New Testament. Think of those New Testament stories that never grow old. Who does not know of the story of the manger and the shepherds and the wise men? Who does not know of the parables and the stories that Jesus taught? Who does not know of the story of the cross and of Judas and Pilate? Who does not know of his death? And who does not know of that empty tomb on Sunday morning when men got there? Folks, that's just not some history book about something that's rather interesting that happened a couple of thousand years ago. That story is timeless because God gave us a book that was timeless. Christianity, as it was given, was intended to be a perpetual law, a perpetual religion. And the quotation marks are no longer there because the Greek word forever means forever and ever. So it'll be when this world does not exist anymore. When Jesus has come back in the fiery judgment and burned up everything on this earth. When this earth is no more, guess what's going to be there? And the dead were judged out of the things that were written in the books. This is going to be there. He that rejecteth me and receiveth not my words hath one that judges him. The words that I've spoken, the same shall judge him on that last day. I'm sure we recognize that no changes were allowed because it is a perpetual, timeless book. You know those verses, the last page of the Bible. Don't add to this book. Don't take away from the book of Revelation. The principles applies to all of the Bible, not going beyond that which was written. You and I need to have an appreciation that even if an angel from heaven came and preached something different from what was found in this book, let that angel be accursed if any man, any human, ignores what God had said and the timeless nature of the New Testament. Because you see, as God protected the Old Testament, God protects the New Testament. Look at Matthew chapter 24, verse 35. Look at the screen and look at one letter there that's highlighted. I hope you see it. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words, in the plural, will by no means pass away. All of them. My words. You mean God protected the New Testament? Oh, yes. If I change one of the words of Jesus or in the transmission of the text throughout all the generations, I no longer have the words of Jesus. They have passed away. But Jesus says, as long as there's heaven, as long as there's earth, His words would be here. You can't change a single word in the Bible and not deny or violate and prove wrong what Jesus said when He said, all of my words will be here. We also need to recognize that what's happened since Jesus has left this earth is the kind of thing that happened when Moses and the prophets were no longer there. People ignored the Bible in Josiah's day. But listen carefully, and especially if you are a visitor, get this point and take this with you. If in the days of Josiah, when they found that Old Testament, they said, we're going to do all of the commandments of the Lord, all of His statutes, all of His judgments, and they were able to restore Judaism to the way it was in the very beginning. Since that Old Testament contained within those words was the seed of Judaism. And when that seed was planted at Mount Sinai, Judaism sprang forth. In Josiah's day, they planted exactly the same seed, and Judaism sprang forth again. And so it is. The New Testament says, the seeds of the kingdom of heaven, the Word of God. Luke chapter 8 and verse 11. And this seed, planted in Jerusalem, in Judea and Samaria, and to the uttermost parts of the world, produced the kingdom of Jesus, the kingdom of heaven, the bride of Christ, the church of God, the church of Christ in the first century. If we take that same seed and do exactly what Josiah did, that is, plant not the seeds of the Old Testament, but the seeds of the New Testament, the only thing that can be produced is that which was produced in the first century, and that is the church that Jesus came and planted on this earth. Visitors, we want you to know that we are in this place trying to be what that sign out front says, and that is a church of Christ, where we take the words of Christ, we don't add to it, we don't take away from it, and we plant that seed today and produce that same church that was there in the first century. If you're visiting with us, and you want to find a church that believes the Bible and that studies the Bible in a way different from the way that others study the Bible, then I urge you to come to this congregation. I urge you to sit down with members of this church. I urge you to come to our Bible classes and see what it's like to do what Josiah did when he got all of the people, small and great, and read to them all of the words of the book. And the people said, and we'll do all of His statutes and His precepts and His judgments. And Judaism was produced. The timelessness of this book, the New Testament, will produce the same today. It is a timeless book and is as relevant today as it was when the men first sat down and wrote the jots and the tittles of the Old Testament, and wrote the alphas and the iotas and the omegas of the New Testament. And God protects His Word and says to us, you follow this and you'll be pleasing to me. You see, there is that timeless plan of salvation, and you need to follow that timeless plan of salvation. You need to believe in Him. Mark 16 and 16 says, he who believes and is baptized will be saved. You need to repent, for it is the will of God that all men come to repentance. 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9. You need to confess with your mouth that you believe Jesus is the Son of God, and when that happens, you can be baptized into Christ. Romans chapter 6 and verse 3. And when people did that in the first century, they became a part of the church, a part of the family. And that's what can happen to you today. Those of us who are children of God know the last thing that'll be on that screen, and that's Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10. And that is, His plan doesn't stop just when we're baptized. There's an ongoing encouragement for us to be full of faith until the day that we die, so that heaven can be ours. how can this church help you go to heaven? We want you to go to heaven. How can we help you? Won't you let it be known by coming to the front right now as together we stand and sing? Will you come?